Thanks everyone for coming. I apologize, we're a couple minutes late, which I hope I never do to my students, but Dr. Grewal and I were having a great conversation, and Christian, thanks for coming in, because we would have stayed there until about 6:30 or so. But we'll continue the conversation. It's interesting for all of you. Before we get started, I just want to thank you, Christian, for putting this all together. I wouldn't be here without Christian's good work. And I should also put in a word of thanks to the Middle East Policy Forum, because they sponsor events like this. And so, and ExxonMobil, who really sponsors them, I also want to thank. But I should thank you in particular for coming down from Cambridge to meet with everyone. And also want to thank you for reading this book, which I highly recommend if you're interested in the subject. And I think it's one of the reasons it's so important is that it examines a central question for any of us who are interested in the Arab Spring. And I say us because we wouldn't be here if we weren't interested, I assume, which is why the Tunisian military went in one direction, the Egyptian military went the other. Questions particularly interesting to me because I served in Cairo and saw a powered military, to use your term, and then was lucky enough to be in Tunisia during the revolution and saw a marginalized military. I've been privileged to know Sharan for quite a while. I say this very ruefully. When we first met, Tunisia was still a democracy. I say that with both as a point of reference, but also with a great deal of sadness as far as what's happened in the country we all had such high hopes for. And just to, I'm sure you've all seen Sharan's bio, so I won't go into as much detail as it deserves, but he's a assistant professor at William and Mary, except this year he's at Harvard as a fellow at the Middle East Initiative, also a non-resident fellow at Brookings here in town, and received his PhD from Princeton a few years back in 2018. So welcome and thanks. And as prearranged, I'm going to just jump right into the questions. And the first question I'll ask is why you decided to write the book.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, and I very much appreciate you moderating this in those status. So why did I write the book? Honestly, I did not intend to write this book. I did not plan to write about the military. I, probably like all of you, was inspired by the Arab Spring. I was inspired by the young people who took to the streets to try to break free from dictatorship, inspired by how just in a matter of weeks, these people power movements were able to topple Mubarak and Ben Ali. And naturally, I was curious then how it was that Tunisia had succeeded, become the success story of the Arab Spring, while Egypt very quickly failed in a military coup. But I hadn't thought at the time that the military was the key difference. When I started the PhD 2013, 2014, I actually thought the bigger difference between Egypt and Tunisia were the Islamists. So my initial hypothesis going into this book project was that there was something about the Islamists that were different, that the Islamists in Tunisia were just more moderate, more willing to compromise than the Islamists in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood. And there's some truth to that, for sure. I had gone to Egypt in 2011, 2012, 2014, and you could see that the Muslim Brotherhood was more insistent on Sharia remaining in the constitution, were hesitant for complete equality for women and for Coptic Christians. And in Tunisia, by contrast, Ennahda was willing to not put Sharia into the constitution, willing instead to put gender equality, freedom of conscience, etc. So there certainly was a big difference between the Islamists in the two countries. But when I finally went to Tunisia, 2014, for the first time, every year since, I quickly realized that that didn't matter so much in the outcome. And what I mean by that is that I met so many of the secularists in Tunisia. And so, for instance, the leftists, the Popular Front, Jabhat al-Shaabiya, and others. And the rhetoric that you hear from them is the same rhetoric that you hear in Egypt from the Brotherhood's opposition. The same rhetoric that Ennahda has a secret apparatus that committed violence domestically, or that they sent foreign fighters to Iraq and Syria, or that they have long-term plans of an Islamic State, even if they appear moderate. This is the same rhetoric that we hear in Egypt about the Muslim Brotherhood. And so even though Ennahda was more moderate, willing to compromise, it didn't really seem to breed goodwill or a change in the attitudes among certainly the leftists, but even among the secularists I met who had allied with Ennahda. So at the Qatar, for instance, or Nida Tunis, certainly, they as well didn't really seem committed to Ennahda having a place in politics. It was more that they had no other choice but to ally with Ennahda. And so I came away from those initial trips to Tunisia thinking that, you know, even if Ennahda was more moderate, that didn't actually change the secularists' beliefs about them. That still in 2013, just like in Egypt, you had mass protests that were calling for Ennahda's government to be overthrown, that were explicitly calling for the military to intervene and a repeat of Egypt to occur. I even found in my research that leaders of Nida Tunis had met with the top generals asking them to stage a coup. So the point being that there seemed to be a real opportunity for a military coup in both countries, despite what the political parties had done or how they had positioned themselves. And so that led me to revise my initial hypothesis going in and to think maybe that's not the bigger difference. The bigger difference is how the militaries responded to that opportunity. Why in Egypt they took the opportunity to stage a coup, and in Tunisia they did not. And so that's therefore what I focused the book on. And I wasn't satisfied with, you know, the existing explanation out there, which is that Tunisia's military is just apolitical and professional, and Egypt's military is politicized. That was certainly part of it, yes. But when I started to interview many of the retired officers, I found that there was a little bit more to the story as well. It was not just about their professionalism. It was also, as I'm sure we're going to discuss, about their corporate interests, how they had been so neglected under Bourguiba and Ben Ali and started to gain from the transition. It was also about their composition, that because the military had been so neglected, did not have high salaries, did not have political influence, it wasn't the elite who was joining the military. It was ordinary Tunisians who identified with the grievances of the protesters and with, in essence, the revolution. That those factors also mattered for why this military didn't stage a coup. So I decided to write the book to get to your question, decided to write the book to focus on what I felt was the missing piece of these two stories, which was the military and why exactly they behaved the way that they did.
Well, that's a good segue into my next question, which is why the situation in Egypt collapsed, if that's the right verb, so quickly. Why did it result in a coup just a year after Morsi was elected? And is there a possibility that things could have turned out differently?
Absolutely. So I focus first on the military in Egypt, that before we look even to the protesters or the Muslim Brotherhood and their opposition, we have to understand the Egyptian military, that they had been in power for 50 years since Gamal Abdel Nasser's coup in 1952. They've in essence been governing the country. Every president came from the military, many ministers came from the military. more governors came from the military than from civilians. It was the officers' republic. And that not only meant that they had interests that they might lose under democracy if civilians start to replace them as president, as governor, as minister, but it also meant that they had become politicized by that there was some socialization effect, even among the lower officers, the cadets, as they're joining the military. They want to model what they're seeing the senior officers do. They view what the senior officers do as what is normal, what's desirable, what a military should do. So if they're seeing the generals become president, become minister, become governor, they start to think that that's what a military should do. And so there's a politicized worldview within the Egyptian military as a result of them being so empowered for 50 years. And then on top of that, beyond the political interest that they have, beyond the politicization that you see, there's also an effect on their composition, that because they had been so powerful and they had been, in essence, the route to power and wealth in Egypt, it shaped also the composition of who joins the Egyptian military. It appeals to the elite in a way that Tunisia's military does not. And so you have a military in Egypt that's stacked also, in essence, with the secular elite, wealthy families who were privileged and enjoying the status quo under dictatorship, not the ordinary folks who wanted the revolution. And so in terms of all three of those, corporate interests that they stood to lose from democracy, a politicization that opposed civilian control, a composition that opposed the revolution, you had a real wariness, even prior to the Arab Spring, to democratization. And so when the revolution then erupted in Egypt, the Arab Spring, this military was hesitant, tried even to repress the revolution. Even though it put out a statement that we're not going to use force against protesters, they actually did. Throughout the 18 days, you can look at Human Rights Watch, they were detaining, arresting, torturing, even killing protesters, all out of the limelight, behind the scenes, not in Tahrir Square, but engaging in repression throughout the revolution, even after pledging not to use force. They couldn't do more than that. They couldn't engage in repression in Tahrir Square for several reasons, but among them, US pressure. That President Obama had publicly come out in favor of the protesters. He had asked US military officers to call their counterparts, pressure them not to massacre the protesters, and that constrained what the Egyptian military could do in the revolution. Ultimately, they had to jettison Mubarak and allow for a revolution. But that doesn't mean that they wanted democratization. So instead, they decide to govern the country directly. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the SCAF, tries to constrain the transition, tries to divide and rule the different parties, play them off of each other and increase polarization as a result, tries even to neuter the parliament and the president even before they take office. They say that the parliament, any law that they pass is going to have to be approved by the SCAF anyway, so they have a veto over what the parliament can do. That the president, even before he's elected, they say he can't actually make security decisions, the military is in charge of that. And so when Morsi finally takes office in the summer of 2012, he has to negotiate with this military over what privileges this military is going to preserve under democracy. To what extent will you have civilian control of this military? And what I think observers got wrong is that Morsi didn't give the military everything it wanted. Morsi did try to strike some sort of pact or bargain with the Egyptian military. He did, for instance, continue to appoint military officers as ministers, continued to appoint military officers as governors, gave the military most of what they wanted in the constitution, but not everything. So Morsi also wanted to be the commander-in-chief, wanted civilian control in the sense that civilians decide security policy and the military implements. And so in the constitution, he made the president commander-in-chief, He changed the composition of the National Security Council so the military would no longer have an outright majority, no longer have a veto as a result. And then he started to make security policy that the military disagreed with. He started, for instance, to encourage Egyptians to go fight against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He threatened Ethiopia with war over the dam they were trying to build on the Nile. He was, by contrast, too lenient towards militants that were in the Sinai. All of this irked the military, which felt that they had lost control over security policy, were not ready to let civilians decide security policy. And so what Morsi did actually aggrieved the military. It wasn't the case that Morsi had formed a pact with them and was respecting all of the military's interests. By contrast, he encroached on the military's turf, tried to impose civilian control in that way. And there's a couple of other encroachments that I detail in the book as well, but Morsi also knew that those encroachments might trigger a coup. Certainly aggrieves the military into having grievance for a coup. But he thought he could get away with it because he thought he had the public support and the international support, critically the US support, to be able to avoid a military coup. Both of those ended up being miscalculations, that he hadn't realized that the military and the police had played a role in funding and coordinating the Tamarrud protests. They didn't expect the protests to be that big on June 30th. And on the US dimension as well, Morsi miscalculated the extent to which what Morsi thought, based on what he was hearing from President Obama, Ambassador Ann Patterson, was that the US was giving a red light to a coup. What they were telling Morsi was that we support democracy, we would not condone a coup, aid therefore would be suspended if a coup were to occur. And so that's what Morsi thinks is the US position, but as David Kirkpatrick and others have shown, others in the administration were actually telling Sisi something different. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, General Mattis, General Flynn, they were meeting with Sisi separately and actually giving more of a yellow light, saying that this is your country, you have to do with it as you wish. The point being that Morsi didn't realize he no longer had the public support, didn't realize that he didn't have the red light from the US that he thought he did, and as a result, pushed the military farther than the conditions allowed. And so those encroachments ended up leading to the coup on July 3rd and terminating Egypt's experiment with democracy. So could it have turned out? Certainly yes, right? If Morsi had not miscalculated, right? If he had realized the military was funding Tamarrud, if he had realized what messages some in the administration were sending Sisi directly, maybe he would have encroached a little bit less on the military, it pleased some of the military's interests even more. And in terms of other counterfactuals, maybe Egypt could have succeeded if the economy was improving and you didn't have the disillusionment, if the secularists hadn't come on board and egged on the military for a coup. But at the end of the day, the military also played a role in each of those counterfactuals, that the military played in, it wasn't the case that the military was just responding to an opportunity to intervene, that the protests were organic and Morsi had polarized and not compromised with all of the other forces. There's also an active role that the military played to isolate Morsi, that already in 2011, the military succeeded in getting the Waft and other older secular parties away from the Brotherhood's alliance by dangling these super constitutional principles in 2011. They then peeled off the National Salvation Front, Al-Baradei and other figures from the Brotherhood by promising them that Al-Baradei would be in charge after the coup. And then they even pulled the Salafis off from the Brotherhood, convincing the Salafis that we'll give you a space in society, you'll have the freedom to proselytize and to preach if you abandon Morsi. So the military played this active role also in isolating Morsi and therefore contributing to the coup. So yes, Morsi could have done more to try to keep a coalition, a united front against the military, but it was really difficult given how politicized and how many interests the military had to try to preserve. It was going to be a difficult fight against the military. Structurally, it's difficult. What I find in the book by looking globally is that it's difficult to transition to democracy when you have an empowered military like this. And I think you're seeing that in Pakistan today. You're seeing this in Myanmar. You're seeing it in Sudan. When you have a military that's been so dominant, empowered, politicized, democratization is very difficult.
Let me shift just a little bit. In the course of researching and then writing your book, what finding or findings surprised you the most, would you say?
Probably the story of what actually happened in Tunisia's revolution. And I just wrote about this in the New Lines piece recently. But this story that I thought was true, and that I think many people still think is true, is that Ben Ali asked the military to fire on the protesters, and Rashid Ahmad said no, right? This is the myth that many of us still believe to this day. But it actually didn't happen. If you try to find the original source of that news, you'll find these articles during the revolution, not in English, but in French and Arabic. You'll see France 24, Jeune Afrique. They have articles from January 12th or so of 2011 during the revolution, saying, according to opposition sources, Rashid Ahmad said no to fire on the protesters, and as a result was fired and replaced by Ahmed Shabir. And we could not confirm with official sources. That's what these newspapers had run during the protests. For some reason, after the revolution, everyone takes it as fact that even though it wasn't officially confirmed at the time, everyone takes it as fact that Rashid Ahmad said no, he's the man who said no, he was the hero of the revolution, and he gains this heroic status moving forward. But it turns out that just a few months later, this myth was actually debunked in two different ways. One was that there was a military trial of Ali Sariati, who was the head of the Presidential Guard, who was accused of conspiring against Ben Ali in the final days. And as part of that military trial, you had almost 40 regime officials, including Rashid Ahmad, testify as to what actually happened in the final days. And so some very smart Tunisian journalists found all the testimonies and used them to figure out what actually happened, to piece together what actually happened in the final days. And their book, this is Abdelaziz Dalfoja and Tariq Sheikhuhu, their book in 2013 tells the real story of what happened in the revolution, which is that Rashid Ahmad was never asked to fire on protesters. And in his testimony, he says that this was a false rumor. I was never asked to fire on protesters, so I never had to say no to Ben Ali. Instead, the only orders that Ben Ali gave to the military were to defend vital institutions, to defend embassies, ministries, and everyone in their testimony confirms this. And I also met with Ali Sariati in 2019, and he likewise said, the only order we gave to the military was to defend institutions. First, on the night of January 8th, they were deployed in Qasrin and Tala, and then starting January 9th, across the country, we had come up with a list of the institutions they would defend, notably including police stations and RCD party offices. And even that, Rashid Ahmad said, okay, to do so, that we'll deploy the military to defend even those institutions. And so what emerges from this account is that Rashid Ahmad actually was more or less loyal until the end, never said no to Ben Ali, because Ben Ali never asked him to repress the protesters, only asked him to defend institutions. But importantly, although Rashid Ahmad and the senior officers never said no, the officers and soldiers who were actually stationed on the ground to defend those institutions, the police stations, the RCD offices, the ministries, etc., often shirked rather than use force to defend those police stations or RCD offices. They looked the other way as protesters burned them down. And so that was the defection that occurred. At the lower levels, the soldiers didn't want to fire on protesters to defend these institutions, especially if the police and the party that had marginalized them historically. And in that context, when Tunisians are seeing the lower ranks of the military defect, that's when this rumor emerges that actually Rashid Ahmad at the top had said no. And also in 2011, separate from the military court, a blogger comes out and says, I invented that rumor. A blogger named Yassine Ayadi, who would later become a member of parliament, he came out in July of 2011 and said, I invented this rumor as a disinformation campaign to try to encourage people to go into the streets thinking that the military was on their side, that the military had already said. And so when he started to spread this rumor, people believed it. Even though it wasn't true, it never happened, Rashid Ahmad denied it, people believed it because they're seeing these soldiers on the ground defect, because they know that this military hadn't repressed, was distant from the regime, was composed of ordinary Tunisians. It made sense, right? This is what we would have expected the Tunisian military to do, so everyone believed the rumor. And so what I write in this New Lines piece is that even though the rumor was false, it had real world consequences. It emboldened people to protest, thinking the military had already said no. It even led to defections within the police. Samir Tarhouni, who was the head of the anti-terrorism brigade, and who is the real reason in many ways that the revolution succeeded in the end. He is the one who mutinied on the final day and arrested the Trabelsis at the airport as they were trying to leave. He told me that the lower ranks in the police also believed the rumor. And so they started to defect in the final days, thinking that we can't crush these protests on our own. And if the military is not going to back us up, there's no hope here for the regime to survive. And so the rumor had these real world consequences, emboldening the protesters, leading the police to defect, and ultimately leading Tarhouni to think the only way we can survive is through some bold action like arresting the Trabelsis, to show them that the rest of the regime is on the people's side, preserve the police at the very least, because look, we're on the people's side. And so he went rogue on that final day, arrested the Trabelsis, and Ben Ali, seeing that mutiny from the anti-terrorism brigade, then seeing in addition other units in the police join that mutiny, other units like the National Guard, Special Forces, the Rapid Intervention Brigades, seeing these cascade of defections on that final day, Ben Ali decides to flee. And so that's the real story of the revolution that, for me, was the most surprising finding, because I had also believed this rumor that Rashid Ahmad said no, and that's why it succeeded.
Well, I think what also probably gave the rumor such credibility was before the revolution, the military had not been involved in any human rights abuses, and everyone knew there was a bit of a gulf between the palace and the military. And then shortly after the revolution, I want to say it was the demonstrations that continued in the Kasbah, when General Amar went among the demonstrators and said, you know, the army stands with the revolution, not a direct quotation. And I think it wasn't just the words, but the fact that someone that senior would mingle with the people after the Ben Ali regime, which wasn't exactly populist. Looking at what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, many of us, all of us who had hopes that there'd be a much more successful transition to democracy, are deeply disappointed, not to understate the issue. A lot of people in the advocacy community are suggesting there should be recommending a cutoff of U.S. assistance to these two countries. I think it's fair to say, given the diplomacy that Egypt and Qatar and the United States are engaged in, there's not going to be a cutoff of assistance to Egypt as long as the Israeli military campaign continues in Gaza. But do you think a freeze of assistance to Tunisia would have any effect?
It's a great question. And so would a freeze of assistance shape the Tunisian military's behavior to take more distance from Qais Said? Or would it have made a difference, for instance, on July 26th, if they had done it right after the military closed the parliament? Yes, but I think to explain why, we also need to understand why the Tunisian military closed the parliament, to then see to what effect would a US position actually have been able to shape their calculations. So when I ask Tunisian officers why they closed the parliament, the first answer they give is about professionalism, that our culture has always been obeying civilian control. We always follow the orders of the commander-in-chief. As you just heard, Rashid Ammar never actually said no to the commander-in-chief. That this is in their culture to be apolitical, and that means to follow the orders of the civilian commander-in-chief. And although they also know that you're not supposed to follow orders if they're illegal or unconstitutional, they didn't have any channel by which to assess whether this was constitutional. They were ordered to close the parliament, that they didn't have constitutional lawyers within the Ministry of Defense like the US military has, the Office of General Counsel, that they could have consulted with. There wasn't a constitutional court yet set up that they could have consulted with. And they themselves, as military officers, didn't feel qualified to judge whether this was constitutional or not. Their expertise is military affairs, they're not constitutional lawyers. And so they decided, in line with this culture of deferring to the president and obeying the commander-in-chief, they decided to defer to the president that this must be constitutional. In part because, as well, this was a constitutional law professor saying, close the parliament. And so they decided to follow the orders, thinking that that was less political, that would be the professional option. That's the first answer they give. And so there already is a lesson for what the US could have done in the years prior to July 25th, which was to, in their training of the Tunisian military, emphasize not only do you obey the civilian and you don't stage a coup, right? What we currently do in IMET and other military training, but also emphasize the other part of that if the civilian does give you an order that's illegal or unconstitutional, you need to have some channels available by which to assess the constitutionality of that order. That wasn't there in Tunisia. So that's lesson one for what the US could have done, missed opportunity in the years prior to July 25th. But then the other part of professionalism that the officers will also say is that we viewed this order to close the parliament like we did in 2011 when we were ordered to secure institutions like a ministry or an embassy. That this was a normal order we receive, that's a legal order that we always do, which is to station tanks and troops outside of a ministry or outside of an embassy and not let anybody in. That's an order that we know that's legal, is to secure an institution. And they preferred to interpret this order to close the parliament in that way, as if it's just any other institution like an embassy or a ministry, not recognizing the political implications of that, as if they didn't want to engage with the political implications, that this is closing a co-equal branch of government, the parliament, that this is inserting yourself in a fight between the parliament and the president, which is a very political thing to do. And so I think that had the US on July 26th messaged to the Tunisian military, what you did was not professional. that actually you shouldn't insert yourself in fights between the president and the parliament, that you should have understood that this was a political action. It's not just securing a ministry or securing a water pump, that this is a parliament. I think that would have gone through. That if the model of professionalism for the Tunisian military is the US military, due to the decades of training that they've received from the US. If the US had messaged that on July 25th, that this was unprofessional, I think it might have changed their behavior. Now, on the contrary, what the US has done in the years since is really the opposite. That the State Department has put out statements that the Tunisian military is still apolitical and professional in our mind. I even heard from the US Embassy and the military attaches there echoing Tunisia's narrative that they were just securing the parliament. They didn't close the parliament, as if there's a meaningful difference there. And so what that message is sending, in my mind, is that Tunisia, what you did was professional. That was the right thing you were supposed to do. If a president orders you to close the parliament, you should, right? And so I think the US is taking the wrong approach here, which is to say they're still apolitical and professional. Instead, the message that we should be sending is that what happened on July 25th was not professional behavior. It's not what we hope the US military would do if Trump ordered our military to close the Congress. So in terms of professionalism, I do think if the US had taken a different approach, it might have made a difference. But then when you dig a little bit deeper and you get to know these officers, you find a couple other reasons for why they obeyed on July 25th. And especially once the constitutional argument became a little less clear, right? Once Qais Said in September, a month later, suspended half of the Constitution, once he dissolved the parliament fully, and once he rewrote the Constitution, it became pretty clear that this argument you made that I'm following the orders because it was constitutional became a little bit more shaky. And then you started to see some other reasons for why they obeyed. And one, again, was their corporate interests. They had been so neglected under Bourguiba and Ben Ali. Things started to improve for them during the transition. That's why they didn't stage, in part, a coup in 2013. And things improved for them even more under Qais Said. Qais Said appointed military doctors as ministers of health, their first ministerial positions in 30 years. They asked the military to take the lead on COVID. It secured, as officers told me, secured the good image of the military in the Tunisian public, that they were taking the lead on COVID. So they were gaining in that sense. He also promoted all of the top generals to two-star generals, the equivalent right before the coup. And two-star is something that, as part of the marginalization historically, Tunisian generals didn't ever get that high. And to promote all of the top generals to two stars right before the takeover was a big move for them. Post-coup has now promoted them all to three-star. And so they're gaining under Qais Said. And so these corporate interests are also part of the reason why they're sticking with Qais Said. There as well, I think a US freezing of assistance, for instance, would work, given that the US military budget represents a sizable chunk of Tunisia's budget, especially given how neglected they were. They don't have that leeway to lose US military assistance. So I do think it would be impactful. But it goes beyond, I think, the actual dollars. If aid gets cut, that's a big hit to the Tunisian military's self-image, because their image, there's an ideological attachment to the West, right? The Tunisian military has only been trained by France and the US historically, and they're proud of that. They tell me that we're so happy we didn't have training in Russia and China or elsewhere in the Middle East. They're proud that they were oriented towards the West historically. And so beyond the dollars, there's also this image that they have that they want to be tied to the West. They want to be tied to the US. And that gives, I think, the US a bit more leverage, that if you were to actually freeze assistance beyond the partial aid cut that we've already done, I do think it would shape the Tunisian military's behavior. And if we have a bit more time on this one, there's also a final reason, I think, for why they obeyed the borders, and this one is a little bit tougher to deal with. And that is that the military's composition. Remember, I said earlier that they come from ordinary families, often in the neglected interior regions, that supported the revolution and therefore also supported the transition. But these ordinary Tunisians, like society writ large, were susceptible to Kais Saied's populist rhetoric. They bought into the rhetoric that he's using, just like Tunisians writ large bought into, that the elite were the problem, the politicians were corrupt, the businessmen are corrupt, and that we need to clean up the system against these elite. That appealed to the Tunisian people and the ordinary Tunisians who are in the Tunisian military. And so there's also a bit of, and the Tunisian military doesn't recognize that this is actually political, right? They say, I hate all of the parties. I'm not siding with one party over another. I hate all of the parties, but that is also very political to say, I want to clean up the system, get rid of all these parties. That's a very political attitude to have. And it's that politicization that you're starting to see in the Tunisian military, this embracing of the populist politics that I think is the final and maybe most important reason for why they're obeying these orders. And that's, I think, the toughest to get around, even if the US were to suspend aid. That said, the final point on this, I know I'm going, is that even if a stronger US stance didn't change Tunisia's behavior, it didn't peel the military off from Kais Saied and reverse the backsliding, it's still important because it sends a signal globally about how the US responds to democratic backsliding, how the US responds to a populist leader taking all the power. If you see that there's actually costs to that US aid will be suspended, you're going to be reprimanded, it's going to be called a coup internationally, then people might think twice about it. So it sends a signal globally about these kind of presidential coups or self-coups that we're seeing increasingly more of in recent years.
Well, I asked the question, excuse me, specifically about Tunisia, but I know, Richard, you had a question that was very much related, but more global, if you want to pose it.
I'm Richard Grewal, investor, great director, student here at UW. My question was how will the U.S. can balance that role of both supporting these legislative democracies in the region, but also still supporting traditional allies who are more autocratic and may not be as open to supporting democracies globally.
Are there some you have in mind in particular of
I think the ones I proposed to Investor Grade were Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, counter democracies like it.
Yeah, well, certainly it complicates, right? It's important that the US has a consistent message in terms of there's always going to be these costs to democratic backsliding. It's difficult to send that message globally when we also want to have good relations with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And those two in particular also create some additional puzzles for how the US should respond to Egypt or Tunisia's transitions, because they're playing a more active role also in trying to support Sisi and in essence advance a counter-revolution after the Arab Spring revolutions. And so that raises another puzzle for how the US should try to advance democracy when you have these counter-revolutionary powers. And while that was very salient in 2013 in Egypt, when Saudi and the Emirates can give 12 billion to Sisi to prop him up, even then, I would say the US had leverage because Saudi and the Emirates can't provide the military assistance that the US can. Yes, they can provide the dollars for budget support, et cetera, but not the military-to-military relations that Egypt's or Tunisia's military really values. So even when you have these very active, powerful counter-revolutionary actors, still I think the US has some leverage. But the second point I would make is that Saudi and the Emirates since then have become a little less active. They have realized in the last few years that they were overextended, being involved not only in Egypt, but in Yemen, Libya, Sudan, and Syria. And therefore started even to stop giving Egypt a blank check, to require a bit more out of CC if money is going to continue to Egypt. And that meant to get to Tunisia again, that when Kais Saied staged his presidential coup in 2021, Saudi and the Emirates were too overburdened, overstretched already to actually shape anything in Tunisia. Maybe they didn't view it as a strategic priority, but I think it's more so that they were overstretched already, that they couldn't give a 12 billion to Kais Saied to consolidate his new regime. Today, you're seeing a little bit of Saudi interest. There was more recently 1 billion pledged in investment in Tunisia. But I think there was, therefore, still, despite Saudi and the Emirates, an opportunity, July 26th, for the US to really shape the trajectory that it failed to take that opportunity.
Yagmar, you had a question also related to the region about Turkey.
Yeah, sure. So my question was, how do you see the military legacies, to use your phrasing, of Turkish President Erdogan's handling of the Turkish military after the 2016 coup attempt?
Yeah, so the question was about Turkey's military and what lessons can we learn from the failed coup there in 2016. So Turkey fits the Egypt model historically, in the sense that Turkey's military had been empowered historically. It had fought a war of independence, and that gave it legitimacy to govern historically. Ataturk himself was a military officer, had promoted the military, had stacked the military with the secular elite in much the same way that in Egypt the military was coming from the secular elite families. And so historically, these militaries were similar under dictatorship. And accordingly, the process of democratization was also very similar, where Turkey post-World War II had these repeated attempts at democratization that routinely ended in a coup, just as Egypt in 2013. But something changed, right? In the 80s, I would say, that made it so that this empowered military couldn't intervene as often. And this might be a lesson for Egypt moving forward, which is that after the coup in 1980 in Turkey, opposition parties realized that we don't want military coups anymore. That the 1980 coup in particular was traumatic. All of the parties got dissolved, thousands were put in prison. The opposition started to realize that even if we hate the incumbent, we don't ask the military to come in, that it doesn't actually solve the country's problems. And so when in 2016, the military attempted this coup against Erdogan, it was important that it wasn't just Erdogan's supporters who took to the streets to protest it. The opposition also took to the streets to protest the coup, that even if we hate Erdogan, doesn't mean we want a coup against him. And that unified rejection of the military is, I think, why the coup failed and why, therefore, Turkey's historically empowered military is now more or less remaining in the barracks, as opposed to remaining a coup threat against the political system. And so that's a lesson, I hope, for Egypt moving forward, which is that if you have that same process of political learning among the opposition parties, that even if you hate Morsi, even if you hate whoever's in charge, asking for a coup is not going to improve the situation. If you get that political learning down the road, maybe you would also be able to rein in Egypt's military down the road.
Brendan, you wanted to ask about Ben Ali's marginalization of the military, given the fact that he was coming from the military?
Yeah, exactly. So Ben Ali's kind of rise to prominence was through the military. So he started his political career. So I was particularly the role he played against colonial France and the resistance. So I guess I'm kind of curious, why do you think he ushered in so much marginalization and neglect to the military? And you would think he would have reverence and appreciation for the impact that would play in resistance.
Why would he marginalize his own if he was from the military? Is the question. So it's actually more common than you think for military leaders to realize the military is a threat to them, right? They know the military well. In some cases, they came to power themselves in a coup, and they realize that the military is a coup threat to them as well. And so their approach might be to marginalize the military, but it could also be to empower the military like in Egypt. That can equally work as a coup-proofing strategy if you keep the military happy. And actually, Ben Ali, when he first came to power, seemed to be pursuing the empowerment strategy. He was appointing, actually, military officers as ministers in the late 1980s when he first came to power. Habib Ahmad became the Minister of Interior, etc. But something changed in 1991, 92. This initial empowerment of the military, putting these military officers as ministers, scared the existing powers within Tunisia. The police, the ruling party, they had been the ones enjoying those ministerial positions before under Bourguiba. And that created some vested interests in them trying to keep the military marginalized so that they would keep getting those ministerial positions rather than the military. And so what happened in the early 1990s is that the police and the party tried to make Ben Ali paranoid of the military so that he would go back to marginalizing it. They even concocted a fake coup plot within the military, this Barakat al-Sahel affair, where they made it seem like the military had allied with Ennahda and was trying to stage a coup against Ben Ali. It wasn't actually true, but it was their way of getting Ben Ali paranoid of the military and going back to marginalizing it. And so that's why he marginalized it. And what I find globally is that this is actually common, that even when it seems like a military regime, there's a military leader at the top, it's not always the case that they empower the military. They often marginalize it as well.
Got lots more great questions from students, but I want to open it up to both audience questions and questions online. And looks like we have an online question. So
we have a couple, so I can just give you one more.
yeah, just we'll start with back.
Okay, the first one is, how do you see the role of Russia in Tunisia? Kais Saied is supposed to visit Moscow before the summer, most probably to engage with Russia on several issues. Tunisian army might also like to get closer to Russia. You please respond.
Great question. So is Russia a threat in terms of US posture towards Tunisia? My reading is no. Kais Saied is looking for allies, but no one has stepped up. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, we've already discussed. Russia and China, you've seen a bit of outreach too. And you might have expected all of these actors to jump on board the opportunity that there is now for supporting Kais Saied and trying to win him over. But Russia and China both also haven't jumped in with aid or really any investment in Tunisia. Partly because both of them are also overstretched, much like Saudi and the Emirates. Russia, of course, with Ukraine, but China also in terms of scaling back some of their investment throughout Africa. And so I don't actually view Russia as that serious that, if the US cuts some of its aid and scales down its relationship, that Russia is going to step in and fill the void. I don't actually see that as credible, given how overstretched Russia already is in Ukraine. The Tunisian army also, I don't think would shift to go towards Russia, both because of the standard reasons that you hear of it takes a while to shift all of your operating equipment when it's been allied with the US for decades. To try to shift it overnight to Russia is a difficult logistical process. But the more important one is the one I made earlier about this ideological attachment that the Tunisian military has to the US and France, where they've been trained historically. They don't want to give that up. They actually say that they're happy that they weren't trained in Russia and China historically. They accuse China of committing genocide against Uyghur Muslims. They don't actually want to switch to China or to Russia for that matter. So I don't view it as a credible fear that if the US scales down its relationship, these other actors are gonna flip the.
Hi, thank you very much. My main question is, what role does the professionalism of the military have to do with how it responded during the Arab Spring? You mentioned Tunisia's army is trained by the US and France. And in the case of Egypt, correct me if I'm wrong, but Egypt's military back then and today is largely composed of rank and file conscripts who serve, 1-2 year periods. Did that influence in any way when it came to the coup and then the repression after, like a couple weeks later, did a professional versus conscript force have anything to play with that?
So yes, both Egypt and Tunisia's militaries rely on conscripts to be the actual soldiers on the ground, the ones who would have to repress the Arab Spring if it came to it. And that was a constraint for both. In Tunisia's case, even the officers, not just the conscripts, but the officers also didn't want to repress. That's why they were shirking and letting police stations get destroyed. But in Egypt, it was a constraint. The officers might have wanted to preserve Mubarak and preserve the system that they had, but conscripts on the ground are not benefiting from the regime. They're forced to serve. They're ordinary Egyptians. They're not going to fire on their countrymen. So that constraint was there for both in terms of how they could respond to the Arab Spring. But among the officer corps, this professionalism that both of them say that they have, even the Egyptian officers say that we are professional officers, we are trained by the US. Their sense of professionalism is very different than the Tunisian military's sense of professionalism. Both say they're professional, but what they mean by it is different. That Egypt's professionalism is one that allows for and encourages a role for them in governance, that they deserve to play that role, and that's their professional duty, is to help govern the country rather than corrupt civilians who don't know what they're doing. That's part of their professionalism, is that politicized belief. And so, yes, they're both professional, but because it's interpreted differently by each, that's what shaped their different behavior.
Okay, so we have a couple questions about countries that aren't covered in the book, Algeria and Libya. And these guests are asking if you can compare these cases to those countries and see how they differ.
Absolutely. So Algeria first is similar to Egypt or Turkey. You have a very empowered military that fought a war of independence, had the legitimacy to govern as a result, and in essence has been governing behind the scenes in Algeria since independence. And so they likewise, like Egypt's military, don't want true democratization. And so when the Hirak protests, for instance, in 2019 erupted, they were not eager to allow for democratization. Their strategy was quite smart, frankly, which was not to repress the protests, not to massacre the protests in order to preserve their interests. It was instead a bit of learning from the earlier Arab Spring protests to instead ignore the protests and let the Algerian protests fizzle themselves out over time. And so Algeria's military survived that revolution in part due to that strategy of simply letting the protesters tire themselves out. They also got very lucky with COVID hitting, ending the protests, at least in the first iteration of it. So Algeria I view very similarly to Egypt. Libya is a bit more difficult of a case, but
That's an understatement.
but it has elements of a marginalization of the military. A key element of marginalization is counterbalancing, where you keep the military weak and you build up rivals to it. You build up in Tunisia the National Guard, the Presidential Guard, the police to counterbalance the military. You have elements of that in Libya under Gaddafi, where the units that were stacked with his tribe, as well as allied tribes, those units were privileged within the military and counterbalanced the rest of the military that were coming from more neglected tribes. And that meant that the military was counterbalanced in that way. The majority of the military were marginalized, while these units that came from Gaddafi's tribe and other allied ones were privileged. And so what it meant during the Arab Spring in Libya was that those marginalized units didn't want to fire on protesters. They sided with the protesters, but the privileged units stuck with Gaddafi. So the military split in 2011 and fought each other. Hence, Libya descended into civil war. And so that version of marginalization, where you counterbalance within the military itself and divide and rule these different units, that's one that's a bit more susceptible to falling to civil war. And so one of the conclusions of the book is that while marginalizing the military generally helps on the path to democratization, it also has these other risks associated with it. One of them being a heightened likelihood of civil war if you've divided and ruled the military in this way. The other risk being a heightened risk of presidential coup when the military is more easily co-opted by a president. And so marginalization in general is conducive to democratization, but also comes with these heightened risks as well.
Any other, Radwan?
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is about US commitment to democracy and what we can learn from the US action or inaction in both coups in Egypt as early as 2013, when supposedly support for democracy was, very high priority, and we were sending mixed messages, to the military. And then in Tunisia, the only successful democracy in the Arab world, when they basically did nothing other than express concern. What does it tell us about the real commitment of the United States?
It tells us that the commitment is quite weak, but here's what I mean by it, which is that we train these militaries historically, Egypt and Tunisia, and we recognize that that gives us a bit of leverage over them. We provide them aid, we provide them training, we built up relations with them that State Department recognizes can give you some leverage in times of crisis. So in Egypt in 2011, during the revolution, we did leverage the relationship. We did, Obama ordered the military to call Egyptian counterparts to urge them not to fire on the protesters. So in some crises, we do exercise that leverage, and it had an impact there in Egypt in 2011. But for some reason in other crises, we decide that that's not the crisis we should use our leverage for. There's almost a reticence there's almost a feeling that if we use our leverage at a time of a coup, for instance, that it's going to be used once and it's done, that we cannot keep a relationship and therefore keep the leverage going long term, that if we suspend aid, it's over at that point. And I think that's a misunderstanding of what the relationship has given us, right? If you've trained this military for 50 years, at that point, you cut aid, they're going to come back to want to continue that relationship. It's not that you cut aid and they're going to look for other partners. If they've been so ideologically, but also materially attached to the US military. And so the reticence that the US does show during these times of crisis to not use their leverage is a mistake, right? The US has much more leverage than it thinks it does during these times of crisis.
Apparently, it's even worse than that because we were sending mixed messages before the coup that happened in Egypt. So the mixed messages preceded the coup. It's not just, we were taken by surprise by the coup and we didn't know how to react. We were sending mixed messages to the military, at least, way before the coup.
Absolutely.
That's the same in Turkey in 1980.
Yeah, and so it's important. Another lesson I think we've seen from Egypt and from Turkey is that it's important for the administration to speak with one voice, right? Obama and Ambassador Patterson, to their credit, were giving a red light, but others in the administration were not. And it was unfortunate that you had that lack of discipline, those mixed voices speaking from the administration at that time in 2013. So a lesson moving forward is that in these crises, you also need to make sure that the administration is speaking. So.
Yeah.
So given your argument about empowered versus marginalized militaries, perhaps one could predict the outcome of these transition periods. So my question is, during these transition periods historically, have you seen countries trying to influence this end result in leadership? And two, given your research, how could countries interested in an end result of democracy utilize your study?
Great question. So I should first say that the model is probabilistic, that statistically it's more difficult to democratize if you have an empowered military, and statistically it's easier with a marginalized military. That's what the data show. But it's not determinative, right? There are some cases that succeed even if you have an empowered military, and some that fail if you have a marginalized one. And I think you learn some lessons from Latin America or from Turkey, as we just discussed, for how you could still get to democracy even with an empowered military. And so lessons there about the US giving a clear red light to a coup, and a clear threat that aid would be suspended would help. Lessons there about how unity might help between the ruling party and the opposition, and a maturity not to call upon the empowered military to intervene. Those lessons can help for getting to democracy even with an empowered military. But I also want to raise the point that in some cases, even when you seem to be doing everything right, it still might not be enough. When we think about Myanmar or Sudan or even Pakistan today, you have wide swaths of the population, even a majority, I would say, in Sudan and Myanmar, that oppose the coup and united against the coup and have mobilized protests continuously against the coups in Sudan and Myanmar. And it's not enough. Even when you have that united front, when you have an empowered military that has interest to preserve, in some cases, they're willing to fight tooth and nail to preserve it, even when you seem to be doing everything right otherwise. So while there are some lessons you can learn to ease the path to democratization, in some cases, it's just really, really difficult.
Yeah, Christian. Okay, why did the Tunisian military turn its back on democracy so quickly, going from helping facilitate the 2011 revolution, but then helped carry out Said's 2021 self-coup? Were they more loyal to governments that empowered them than to specific forms of government?
Yes, would be the easy answer, right? It comes to all three of these factors. Their professionalism was a double-edged sword that, yes, it makes them less likely to stage coups, but it also makes them more likely to obey orders to close down parliament. Their corporate interests were advanced even further under Said. Their composition aligned in terms of embracing the populism of Kais Saied. So that's why this soldier of democracy that initially supported the transition, hence the question, they flipped in their support for democracy.
Other questions? Yeah. So looking forward, where do you see both? We can look. I'm personally more interested in Tunisian military. But where do you see these two militaries headed? I mean, in Egypt, you have some rather significant economic difficulties that the country's facing right now, on top of the role the military plays in some of these industries that are collapsing and just struggling. And then within the Tunisian military, made a rather compelling argument for them not necessarily being apolitical, but where are they going? What is in the future for these groups, and like what are the things that you are looking for that would lead you to go in one direction or the other, whether it be apolitical or increasingly political?
Both great questions, and unfortunately, I only have somewhat pessimistic answers, which is that for Egypt, I don't yet see a change, right? Sisi is certainly empowering them even further, getting them involved into even new areas of the economy that they hadn't before under Mubarak. And even though the economy—
New lands on the beaches.
New lands on the beaches, a new capital city where the military is not only building it, but building their own houses that they're going to live in. And even though the economy is crashing, Egyptians aren't blaming the military, right? Maybe Sisi is going to get the blame, but it's not extending to the rest of the military yet, at least. The military has been strategic in, whenever there is a crisis, they hand out bread that they themselves have made. And it improves their image even further, that they're actually on the side of the people helping try to improve the economy. And so even though Sisi's popularity might decline, I don't think it's going to get attached to the military yet. There was a moment in 2019 when you had those protests that were sparked by these videos, right? Muhammad Ali had put out these videos of corruption in the military. And that might have been a move towards maybe we're going to associate corruption in the military as the problem of the economy, but it didn't quite get there. So for Egypt, I don't yet see the population turning against the military and saying we need to get them out of the economy again and out of politics. For the Tunisian military, where is it headed? You are right that things are changing, right? Now they have ministerial positions that they've never had before, not just Minister of Health, but also Minister of Agriculture now. They are involved in political decisions in a way that they have never been before. Their salaries, budget, et cetera, are increasing. Not quite enough to the point where we would say they're empowered like Egypt's, but if things continue on for a couple decades under Kais Saied like this, I think we would start to say and start to question, how is this military changing as a result? The next time there is a revolution, are they going to side with the people, or are they now empowered so much and tied to the regime so much that maybe next time around they would repress the protesters? There is some real danger here that Tunisia's model of having historically marginalized the military is now shifting towards more of an empowerment model. It's too early to say, I think, at this point, but if you have another decade of Kais Saied advancing the military's interests, it's hard to say how that military would react to another bout of democratization down.
What would be the things you look for in Tunisia that would tell you that it's leaning one way or the other?
So certainly in terms of ministerial positions, if you see this continue to grow beyond agriculture. Agriculture, they kind of have an argument that, the Tunisian military has been involved in land reclamation and regime Matoug in the south, and so had been involved in producing a few dates and therefore might have had some agricultural experience. And so, okay, you can make a case for them being involved in that ministerial position. But if you start to see them in other ministries, that it's really hard to say the military had some expertise for that domain, and you start to see that sort of involvement in political decision making, that would be a sign. But the other thing is that this takes decades to shift the professionalism mentality. That the next generation of officers has to come to see that this is what we should be doing, that we should be this involved in politics. And that's a longer term process. At this point, I don't think we're there. Even this Minister of Agriculture, for instance, he's never appearing in uniform. He's not referred to by Kais Saied or the media as a general. He still presents as civilian. And so that's a good sign that the norms are still being applied, that they're not yet militarizing the Ministry of Agriculture. They're still trying to say this is a civilian, he's left the military. And so in that sense, the norms are a little bit sticky, and it's not going to be changing overnight, I think, to this more politicized mode.
You previously referenced Latin America. Chile seems to be one of the countries that, through democratic elections, disengorged a powerful military. Are there lessons there that could apply to the countries in North Africa and the Middle East?
Absolutely. And the lessons there is, in essence, that for Chile and Uruguay, for instance, that the military juntas that had been in charge made such a mess of the economy that people blamed the military for being in politics, not just that individual leader who was in charge, but the military writ large. And so you had populations as a whole turn against the military's involvement in politics and the economy. And so that has helped their democratization. But as we just indicated, I don't think we're there yet for Egypt. But certainly there's those lessons about how Latin America made it.
I had a question, Sharan. Maybe your favorite question too, but where do you think the sort of the bargaining stands today within, or let's say, closed doors Because there is the MOI that's involved, the Ministry of Interior and the military, which are both back at Kais Saied now. But what I was thinking is that Kais Saied's popularity seems to be falling tremendously. I mean, the elections were attended by only 11% of the population that he staged. And the economy is not doing any better, not to say worse. And all the other parties are now against him, that is clear, or more or less, with certain small exceptions potentially. What do you think is the potential? I know this is a hard question, but for everyone to find us, but when I was in Tunisia last time was a year ago, I was talking to people, what they were saying is that I was asking people like, what is the potential that they will decide to get rid of Saeed and puts one of them up there instead, if Saeed's cannot manage to do the things done, get the things done.
It's a great question. I'm reluctant to try to predict where
Yeah,
Tunisia is
yeah, of
gonna
course I
go.
know, but how do you think?
But I am a little bit skeptical of the notion that Kais Saied has lost his popularity.
Mm.
I agree that, you know, we have to take the opinion polls with a grain of salt. People don't want to openly criticize Kais Saied. So the numbers that you're seeing of that he still has 80, 70% support, of course, we can take that with a grain of salt. But I don't think just because very few people voted in his local elections or even in the parliamentary elections, that means he is no longer popular. When he is on the ballot, he did get people out to vote. When even on the constitution that he put out, which is in essence became a referendum on his rule, people did turn out in the sense that if you look at the numbers, the 2.7 million who voted yes on the constitution, that's similar to the 2.7 who had voted for him in the second round of the 2019 elections. So in that sense, he still had considerable public support, even though the turnout seemed a little bit low because the opposition boycotted. So I'm not sure. And the true test will be the next presidential elections when he's actually on the ballot. That will be the test of whether people will turn out for him, even if they're not turning out for a parliament that they don't care about or local elections that they don't care about. And so I think it's too early to conclude that he's lost his popularity. The other thing is that, and the reason why, is that even though the economy is worse by every measure, right, shortages of basic goods, he doesn't seem to be getting the blame. He is able to deflect away to say, this is the old political parties, this is the lobbies, this is the sub-Saharan African migrants, this is the US. He's able to effectively deflect blame from the economy. And it seems that people are giving him the benefit of the doubt for now, that these are problems that were inherited by Kais Saied, not something of his own making. And so at this point, I do still think Tunisians are giving him a chance and not yet ready to say, Kais Saied has to go. That's why I don't think you're seeing, mass disaffection with him or protests against him. And it's only if you had that scenario, the masses turning on him, would I think there's any possibility of a police or military trying to remove him. But even those, I think, are really unlikely scenarios. The more likely one is that he survives another term as president. And maybe then when he tries to stand for a third term, that might be the spark that says, okay, you've gone too far. You're supposed to stick to a 2-term.
I think we have time for one more question, Shana.
Thanks, thanks for your presentation. My question is that, recent sort of research has shown a pretty powerful empirical correlation between US military assistance and every bad thing, right? So increased human rights abuses, more violence, less democracy, more civil conflict. So it seems to me that US leverage in that regard would be the absence of US involvement in terms of providing military assistance. But I can't really think in my memory of any case where the US actually did cut off military assistance. Really, I can't think of a single example. Maybe it was delayed for a few months, but it was never sort of reversed. And to me, that suggests that the interests that are behind the promotion of that military assistance, namely the military industrial complex, are more powerful really than the policymakers who are making these kinds of very critical foreign policy decisions. So what would you say to someone who sort of sees this and sort of throws up their hands and is like, if the US has leverage, but they've never used it, why are we talking about it? why don't we use the one obvious tool, which would be to suspend all these, not just material assistance, but also the training programs and other.
It's a great question, right? Where the initial reason for providing this training with the military aid was never to democratize, right? The initial reason were security and strategic interests, and those remain, and hence DoD and others make a strong argument to the policymakers that those interests we need to continue to preserve regardless of the political context. And so challenging that is difficult, right, for the policymakers that care about democracy and are committed to cutting aid. And to their credit, in some cases, they do get a partial aid cut. In Tunisia, military aid even has been cut in half, even if not zeroed out, which I think would be more effective. Even in Egypt, you could say after the Rabaa massacre, there was a brief partial aid suspension, even if it was more of a slap on the wrist rather than meaningful. But that is to say that there is a strong debate within the administration every time there is a coup about what to do in terms of military aid. It's not inevitable, therefore, that DoD is always going to win and aid is going to continue. And I think the correlations that people are finding now between US military training and coups and repression is making it more difficult to continue US military training, and gives the policymakers a stronger argument to say that maybe we should reevaluate these training programs. Maybe US training is also having some adverse effects. It might be strengthening their capacity to repress, strengthening their ability, therefore, to coordinate a coup as well. And maybe that's the reason why US training seems to be correlating with a coup. I still think it could well be that the militaries that the US trains are in context of greater crises and greater context that might be more conducive to coups and repression, and it may not be US training per se. But some of the work I have done as well in Tunisia has shown some of these adverse consequences of US training, that some of the officers, you could say, see what they want to see in the US. The ones that want more of a political role can point to things in the US that would justify that. Look at what I hear from some Tunisian officers that want to get involved in politics is that, hey, look how many retired generals become Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. Look at how many officers Trump appointed into his administration. Therefore, if the US is the model we should follow, it actually allows a bit of politicization. And so those adverse consequences that I think we're not yet engaging with, that US military training might also be politicizing some militaries, I think is one that we need to do a bit more research into, but I think would give the policymakers a stronger argument against DoD for continuing these without any kind of consideration.
Great. Well, I want to, Sharan, thank you so much for writing the book and for sharing your insights with us. And thanks to everyone here for your attention, your great questions. And please join me in a round of applause for our guests. Yeah.